In 1874, in the Holloway district of North London, a girl was brought into the Workhouse infirmary. She gave her name only as Mary E. and refused to explain more. When asked about her parents, she spoke a single, haunting phrase: "They had no faces." From that moment, her story entered the records, and then, just as quickly, disappeared. Let us know where in the world you are listening from, because stories like this remind us that not all mysteries are lost to the past. The Workhouse Infirmary in Holloway stood as a grim necessity in the sprawl of North London, a place where the destitute found themselves when sickness or despair outran their means. On a damp November evening, the girl known as Mary E. was carried through its doors by a stranger, a man whose name does not appear in the surviving records. He claimed to have found her on a street corner near Seven Sisters Road, crouched against a wall, her thin frame wrapped in a shawl too threadbare to keep out the chill. She was estimated to be no older than 12, though her exact age was never confirmed. Her dark hair was matted, her eyes sunken, and her limbs so frail they seemed to belong to a much younger child. The workhouse porter noted her arrival in the ledger with a brevity that speaks to the era's indifference. Female, juvenile, unknown origin, admitted 3rd November, 1874. The infirmary was a place of stark utility, its walls stained with damp and its air heavy with the scent of carbolic soap and sickness. Mary E. was placed in a narrow iron bed in the women's ward, one among dozens lined in rows beneath high, drafty windows. The attending physician, Dr. James Whitlock, examined her that same evening. His notes, preserved in the Islington Poor Law Union archives, describe a girl who was alert but uncooperative. She spoke little, answering questions with single words or silence. When pressed about her family or where she had come from, she offered only that strange, repeated phrase: "They had no faces." Whitlock recorded her words without comment, as if unsure how to interpret them. What struck the staff most was her refusal to eat. The workhouse diet, meager as it was, gruel, bread, and weak tea, was offered to her daily, yet she turned away from every tray. Nurses reported that she would stare at the food, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if the act of eating was a violation she could not bear. By the 3rd day, the head matron, Mrs. Eliza Carter, wrote in her log that the girl takes no nourishment, though no physical obstruction is found. The term self-starvation appeared in the medical notes by the end of the 1st week, a phrase that carried both a diagnosis and a question. No fever, no cough, no signs of consumption or wasting disease could be identified. Her pulse was weak but steady, her skin pale but unbroken by sores or rash. She was a puzzle to the staff, who were accustomed to the familiar ailments of poverty: tuberculosis, rickets, or the slow grind of malnutrition, but not this deliberate rejection of sustenance. The workhouse was no stranger to children. Orphans, abandoned infants, and runaways passed through its gates with regularity, their stories often reduced to a line or two in the ledgers. Yet Mary E. stood out, not for what she said, but for what she withheld. Her silence was not the vacant stupor of exhaustion or illness, but something active, almost defiant. When a nurse attempted to coax her with a spoonful of broth, she shook her head and whispered her cryptic phrase again, as if it explained everything. The staff began to avoid her bed, their unease growing with each passing day. The porter, a man named Thomas Reed, later remarked to a local journalist that there was something not right about her, something that made you look away. Holloway in 1874 was a district of contrasts, its streets lined with new terraced houses for the growing middle class, while the poor crowded into crumbling tenements and lodging houses. The workhouse stood as a looming reminder of the fragility of survival, its high brick walls casting long shadows over the surrounding lanes. For a child like Mary E. to appear alone, without family or history, was not unusual. London swallowed its vulnerable with ease, and the workhouse was often the last stop before anonymity. Yet her case lingered in the minds of those who saw her, not because of her condition, but because of the void she seemed to carry with her. a void that began with her words and grew in the silence that followed. By the second week of her stay, the medical staff noted a steady decline. Her weight, already perilously low, continued to drop. Her skin grew almost translucent, her breathing shallow. Yet her eyes, according to one nurse's report, remained bright and watchful, as if she were observing something the others could not see. The workhouse chaplain, Reverend Henry Poole, visited her on November 10th, hoping to draw out some detail of her past. He recorded in his journal that she spoke not of God or family, only of faces she could not describe. Her refusal to eat had become a kind of ritual, a choice that baffled and unsettled those tasked with her care. The records show no attempt at force-feeding, a practice not uncommon in workhouses for those deemed recalcitrant. Instead, they watched her fade, their notes growing shorter as if they too were retreating from her mystery. The Holloway Workhouse Infirmary was not a place for long stays. Patients either recovered or were moved to other institutions, hospitals, asylums, or most often the morgue. Mary E.'s case, however, defied this pattern. Her file contains no mention of a transfer, no record of a worsening condition that would explain an abrupt end. The last entry, dated November 15, 1874, simply repeats the phrase self-starvation and notes her continued refusal of food. After that, the record goes silent. No death certificate, no burial notation, no discharge. She was there, and then she was not. In the weeks that followed, the staff spoke of her in hushed tones. The porter claimed she had left no trace, no clothing, no belongings, nothing to mark her presence beyond the ledger, and a single phrase that refused to be forgotten. The Holloway district, with its fog-choked streets and crowded alleys, seemed to absorb her story as it had so many others. Yet her words, they had no faces, lingered, a fragment of a life that refused to be fully erased. The workhouse continued its grim routine, its beds filled and emptied, but for those who had seen her, Mary E. remained a shadow, a question mark etched into the margins of history. The Workhouse Infirmary in Holloway, like others across Victorian London, was a place of last resort, a grim intersection of charity and control. In 1874, these institutions were the backbone of the poor law system, designed to deter idleness as much as to relieve suffering. The Islington Poor Law Union, which oversaw Holloway's workhouse, housed hundreds at any given time. Men, women, and children packed into wards separated by gender and age, their lives governed by strict routines of labor and prayer. The infirmary itself was a cramped wing, its walls bare save for the occasional peeling notice of regulations. Beds were iron, mattresses thin, and the air carried the constant tang of disinfectant, a futile defense against the odors of sickness and neglect. Patients arrived with ailments born of poverty, consumption, fever, broken bones from factory work, or the slow decay of hunger. For a child like Mary E., admitted in November 1874, the infirmary offered little beyond a bed and the scrutiny of overworked staff. Medical care in workhouses was rudimentary, shaped by the era's limited understanding of disease and a deep suspicion of the poor. Physicians like Dr. James Whitlock, who examined Mary, were often part-time appointees, juggling private practices with their workhouse duties. Their tools were basic: stethoscopes, thermometers, and little else. Diagnosis relied heavily on observation and guesswork, with treatments leaning on tonics, purges, or in dire cases, surgical intervention without anesthesia. For those refusing food, as Mary did, the medical response was often confusion rather than clarity. The term self-starvation in her file was not a formal diagnosis but a description, a placeholder for a condition that defied the era's medical lexicon. It appeared in the notes of Dr. Whitlock and the head matron, Mrs. Eliza Carter, as if to capture their bafflement at a girl who turned away sustenance without apparent cause. Victorian medicine had only begun to grapple with disorders of the mind or will. Hysteria, a catch-all term for unexplained behaviors, was often applied to women and girls who resisted norms, but Mary's youth and silence did not fit neatly into such categories. The workhouse records show no signs of fever, No lesions, no wasting diseases like tuberculosis that might explain her decline. Her pulse, though weak, was steady. Her lungs, when examined, were clear. The staff noted her alertness, a troubling contrast to her physical deterioration. By November 10th, a week into her stay, her weight had dropped further, her skin taking on a pallor that alarmed the nurses. Yet her eyes, as one attendant wrote, seemed to see beyond the room, a phrase that hints at the unease she provoked. Refusal to eat was not unknown in workhouses. Hunger strikes, though rare, were sometimes recorded among inmates protesting their conditions. Gruel too thin, bread too stale, or the endless monotony of labor. But Mary's case was different. She did not rage or plead, she simply refused. The staff tried broth, milk, even small bits of bread softened in water, but she would press her lips shut or turn her head away. The matrons log records an attempt to coax her with a boiled egg, a rare luxury in the workhouse, but Mary only stared at it, her hands still in her lap. The phrase self-starvation appeared again in the records, underlined in Dr. Whitlock's hand, as if to emphasize the absence of answers. The medical notes grew sparse, reflecting a kind of resignation. By November 12th, they recorded only her weight, barely 5 stone, and the continued refusal of food. In the broader medical context of 1874, London's physicians were beginning to document cases of prolonged fasting, particularly among young women. The term anorexia nervosa would not be coined until 1873 by Sir William Gull, and even then, it was poorly understood, often conflated with religious fasting or mental instability. Workhouse doctors, far removed from such academic debates, had little framework for a case like Mary's. They knew of scurvy, of rickets, of the slow grind of malnutrition that marked so many of their patients, but a child who chose to starve without visible illness was beyond their experience. Some speculated she might be consumptive, despite the lack of cough or fever. Others wondered if she was touched, a vague term for madness. Yet her silence and composure undermined these theories. She did not rave or weep, as those labeled insane often did. She simply wasted away, her body a quiet rebellion against the act of living. The workhouse system itself was ill-equipped for such cases. Infirmaries were built to manage acute illness or injury, not mysteries of the mind or spirit. Patients who lingered too long were a burden on resources, their beds needed for the next wave of the sick. Mary's continued presence, her refusal to recover or die neatly, strained the patience of the staff. The chaplain, Reverend Henry Poole, visited her twice, his journal noting her unwillingness to speak of family or faith. He offered prayers, but she did not respond, her gaze fixed on some unseen point. The nurses, overworked and hardened by years of tending to the desperate, began to avoid her bed, their unease recorded in passing comments about her strange manner. London's medical community in 1874 was a world of contradictions, caught between old superstitions and emerging science. Workhouse infirmaries were often the last stop for those who could afford no better, their records a mix of precision and neglect. Mary's file, preserved in the Islington archives, is a thin document, its pages brittle and ink-faded. It lists her admission, her condition, and the persistent note of self-starvation, but offers no resolution. The staff's frustration is palpable in the brevity of the entries, as if they hoped to contain her mystery within the lines of their ledgers. Yet the absence of answers only deepened the enigma. She was not violent, not feverish, not visibly mad, only silent, starving, and inexplicably apart from the world around her. The Holloway Workhouse, like others, was a place where the poor were counted, categorized, and often forgotten. Its records were meticulous in their way, tracking admissions, discharges, and deaths with bureaucratic efficiency. But Mary E.'s case slipped through the cracks of this system. Her file does not note a recovery, a transfer, or a death. It simply stops, as if she had faded not just from the infirmary but from the machinery of record-keeping itself. The physicians and nurses moved on to other patients, their attention pulled to the endless tide of need. Yet her presence lingered in the margins, a question mark in human form, her refusal to eat a silent challenge to the order of the workhouse and the city beyond. The streets of Holloway in 1874 were a maze of contrasts, where the smoke of factories mingled with the fog that rolled in from the Thames. The district was home to both the aspiring middle class and the destitute, their lives divided by invisible lines of wealth and want. In the shadow of the workhouse where Mary E. lay wasting in her infirmary bed, whispers began to circulate among the locals. Her arrival, marked by little more than a ledger entry, had not gone unnoticed. The man who brought her to the workhouse, a stranger whose name was never recorded, spoke to a few neighbors before vanishing into the November dusk. He mentioned a girl found alone, her cryptic words about parents with no faces. And soon the story took root, spreading through the tenements and public houses like damp through timber. In Victorian London, folklore thrived in the gaps left by official records. The poor, with little access to newspapers or books, wove their own explanations for the unexplained. By mid-November, as Mary's condition worsened, the whispers grew louder. A washerwoman in a lodging house near Seven Sisters Road claimed the girl was cursed, her refusal to eat a sign of some older, darker affliction. Others spoke of children who wasted away, their lives stolen by unseen forces, spirits perhaps, or the lingering malice of a city that devoured its young. The phrase, "they had no faces," became a kind of talisman, repeated in hushed tones by those who heard it secondhand. A costermonger, interviewed years later by a local historian, recalled the story as something you didn't speak of too loud, lest it follow you home. These tales were not unique to Mary E. Victorian. England was steeped in stories of spectral curses and lost children. The workhouse itself, a looming brick edifice, was often cast as a place where souls were trapped as much as bodies. Neighbors spoke of other cases, children who arrived without names, who sickened and died without explanation, their stories dissolving into the city's churn. Yet Mary's words set her apart. "They had no faces" was not a common phrase, not a fragment of scripture or street slang. It carried an eerie specificity, a detail that felt both intimate and unreachable. Some speculated her parents were dead, their faces lost to memory. Others wondered if she had seen something unspeakable, a trauma that locked her voice and closed her mouth to food. The official records, preserved in the Islington Poor Law Union archives, offer no echo of these rumors. They are clinical, sparse, and silent on the whispers that swirled beyond the workhouse walls. Mary E.'s file notes her admission on November 3rd, her self-starvation, and her steady decline, but nothing more. The ledger entries are written in the neat, impersonal hand of the porter and physician, as if to anchor her mystery in the mundane. There is no mention of the stranger who brought her, no record of inquiries into her origins. The workhouse was a place of containment, not investigation. Its purpose was to manage the poor, not to unravel their stories. Yet the absence of detail in the records only fueled the local tales, as if the silence itself were proof of something hidden. The Holloway community was no stranger to loss. Children vanished often, into workhouses, factories, or the streets themselves. Infant mortality was high, and those who survived childhood faced disease, hunger, or the slow grind of poverty. The workhouse infirmary saw its share of young patients, many of whom left no trace beyond a name and a date. Mary E.'s case, though, lingered in the collective memory, not for her fate, but for the fragment she left behind. Her words about faceless parents were repeated by shopkeepers and laborers, passed along like a ghost story. A seamstress, speaking to a clergyman in 1875, claimed the girl's phrase was a warning, though of what she could not say. The lack of answers only deepened the unease, as if her story were a wound that refused to close. The contrast between the folk rumors and the official silence is stark. The workhouse records, meticulous in their way, track the daily grind of admissions and discharges, but they offer no resolution for Mary E. Her file ends abruptly on November 15, 1874, with a final note of her continued refusal to eat. There is no mention of a death, no record of a burial, no indication she was moved to another institution. In a system that prided itself on documentation, this gap is striking. Workhouses were required to account for their inmates, living or dead, yet Mary's story simply stops. The absence of a burial location is particularly telling. The Islington Poor Law Union maintained a cemetery for paupers, its plots marked by simple stones or nothing at all, but no trace of Mary E. appears in its registers. The whispers in Holloway persisted long after her file went silent. A publican near Caledonian Road claimed to have heard her story from a workhouse nurse who spoke of a girl who looked through you, not at you. Another tale, recorded in a 1876 parish newsletter, suggested Mary had been seen wandering the streets before her admission, always alone, always silent. These stories, though unverified, filled the void left by the records. They were not sensational, not filled with the Gothic flourishes of later ghost tales, but they carried a quiet dread, a sense that something had been left unfinished. The phrase, "they had no faces," became a kind of shorthand, a way to name the unnameable in a city where loss was commonplace. The workhouse staff, bound by routine, did not engage with the rumors. Their focus was on the living, the endless stream of patients who filled the infirmary's beds. Yet even they could not fully dismiss Mary's presence. The porter, Thomas Reed, later told a journalist that her bed remained empty for weeks after she was gone, as if no one wanted to claim it. The chaplain, Reverend Henry Poole, wrote in his journal that he prayed for her soul, though he could not say why he felt the need. The official silence, mirrored by the staff's reticence, only deepened the mystery. Holloway's streets, thick with fog and secrets, seemed to swallow her whole, leaving only her words to echo in the minds of those who heard them. The folklore surrounding Mary E. was not about answers, but about questions. About what could drive a child to starve herself. About what she meant by no faces. About why her story ended without a trace. In a city of millions, where the poor were often invisible, her fragment of a life stood out, a single thread in the tapestry of London's forgotten. The whispers faded over time as whispers do, but they never fully vanished. They lingered in the corners of Holloway's pubs and parlors, a reminder that some stories, however brief, refused to be buried. The Holloway Workhouse in the winter of 1874 was a machine of relentless routine, its ledgers a testament to the lives that passed through its gates, counted, categorized, and often erased. Mary E., the girl who arrived in November, left behind only a thin file in the Islington Poor Law Union archives, a handful of pages that end as abruptly as her presence. The final entry, dated November 15th, notes her continued self-starvation, her weight a mere shadow of what a child her age should bear. After that, the record stops. No discharge, no transfer, no death certificate. In a system that thrived on documentation, this silence is a fracture, a gap where a life should have been accounted for. Mary E. vanished from the workhouse, leaving only her haunting phrase, "They had no faces," to linger in the margins of history. Victorian London was a city that devoured its children. The workhouses, orphanages, and overcrowded tenements were filled with those who slipped through the cracks of progress, their names reduced to initials, or lost entirely. The Islington Poor Law Union, which oversaw Holloway, recorded thousands of admissions each year, many of them young, orphans, runaways, or those abandoned by families too poor to keep them. Death was a frequent visitor, its arrival marked by a curt entry in the ledgers, a date, a name, a plot in the pauper's cemetery. Yet Mary E.'s file lacks even this closure. The absence of a burial record is stark. The workhouse maintained a graveyard at St. Mary's, Islington, where the unclaimed were laid in unmarked plots, but no trace of her appears there. It is as if she stepped out of the world, leaving only whispers and a single unsettling sentence. The disappearance of her records is not unique. Workhouse archives were often incomplete, their pages lost to fire, damp, or neglect. Clerks, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of human suffering, sometimes failed to note a death or transfer. Children especially could vanish into the system's gaps, sent to other institutions, reclaimed by unknown relatives, or simply overlooked. Yet Mary's case stands out, not for its tragedy but for its brevity. Her file is a fragment, a story cut short without explanation. The porter, Thomas Reed, later remarked to a local journalist that he could not recall what became of her, only that her bed was left empty, as if the infirmary itself had exhaled her presence. The nurses, too, offered no answers, their logs silent after that final entry. In Holloway, the city's pulse was one of survival, its streets a tangle of labor and loss. The workhouse stood as a grim monument to this reality, its walls a barrier between the poor and the world that passed them by. Mary E.'s story, brief as it was, became a thread in the district's fabric, woven into the conversations of those who lived nearby. Her phrase, "They had no faces," was repeated in quiet corners, a riddle that defied the logic of poverty and sickness. It was not the stuff of Gothic horror, not the sensational tales of later years, but something quieter, more pervasive. It was the kind of story that settled into the bones of a place, carried by those who walked the same streets where she was found. The silence of the records mirrors the silence of the girl herself. She spoke little, ate nothing, and offered only that one phrase to anchor her existence. The workhouse staff, accustomed to the churn of human misery, had no framework for her mystery. The physician, Dr. James Whitlock, recorded her condition with clinical detachment, his notes trailing off as if he too had no words for what she was. The chaplain, Reverend Henry Poole, prayed for her but found no solace in her gaze. The matron, Mrs. Eliza Carter, wrote of her refusal to eat with a hint of exasperation, as if Mary's choice was a personal affront to the order of the infirmary. Yet none could say where she went or what became of her. The system designed to contain the poor could not contain her story. London in 1874 was a city of ghosts, its streets haunted by the forgotten. The workhouse was only one of many places where lives were reduced to ink and paper, their endings often unwritten. Children like Mary E. were the most vulnerable, their stories the least likely to survive. The Islington archives are filled with such fragments, names without endings, lives without resolution. Yet Mary's phrase, those 4 words spoken to a nurse in a moment of quiet, has outlasted the ledgers. It has been carried forward, not by historians but by the people of Holloway, who told her story long after the workhouse gates closed. The absence of her burial record is perhaps the most haunting detail. Workhouses were meticulous about death, if only to clear beds for the living. The lack of such a record for Mary E. suggests something beyond oversight, a lapse that feels almost deliberate, as if her departure was meant to go unmarked. The Paupers' Cemetery at St. Mary's holds no trace of her, nor do the records of nearby hospitals or asylums. She was not claimed by family, not sent to another institution, not buried in the usual way. The city, with its endless hunger for lives, seems to have swallowed her whole, leaving only her words to echo in the fog. History often forgets the children of its cities. In Holloway, where the workhouse once stood, the streets have changed, the tenements replaced by terraces and shops. The records of the Islington Poor Law Union survive in fragments, their pages yellowed and brittle, their stories reduced to dates and ailments. Yet Mary E., known only by her initials and her single cryptic phrase, remains a shadow on the edge of memory. Her file, incomplete and unresolved, is a testament to the countless others who vanished without trace, their lives erased by a city that moved on without them. But her words, "They had no faces," refuse to fade. They linger like an unfinished story, faceless, nameless, and unresolved. The story of Mary E., the Holloway Child of 1874, ends where it began, in a void of unanswered questions, her single phrase, "They had no faces," echoing through the years. The workhouse records, silent on her fate, leave us with only fragments, a girl, a refusal to eat, and a mystery that lingers like the fog that once choked North London's streets. Her words, preserved by whispers and chants, are all that remain, a haunting trace of a life unaccounted for in the vast machinery of Victorian England. We invite you to share your thoughts on this unsettling tale. What do you make of Mary E.'s cryptic words? Have you encountered other stories of forgotten children in the archives of history? Let us know where you're listening from and what this fragment of the past stirs in you. Because even in the silence of the records, some voices refuse to be forgotten.